Chapter 295. The Indian Maidservant and the Old Saudi Man, Part 5. The mother's movements woke up her daughter. At once Rayhana told Ifat to close her eyes until she could put her dress back on. Her daughter obeyed her and closed her eyes. It took Rayhana more than half an hour to put on her clothes. Then, she told her daughter to open her eyes. Ifat ran to her mother and hugged her. She felt so relieved when she saw that her mother had come back to life. Rayhana knew that Ifat had seen everything those evil men had done to her. She remembered hearing her tender voice screaming and crying for her while those vicious animals tore her apart and ripped off her clothes. While they were stripping her naked in front of her child, she felt as if they were skinning her alive. They had removed her handcuffs and stripped every piece of clothing from her body. She could not resist or try to protect her honor. She was afraid if she resisted, they would go for her little daughter instead. She was thus paralyzed by the thought of these ruthless men raping and attacking her child. At this moment, if it wasn't for her daughter, Rayhana would have killed herself. Ifat's loving touches and hugs gave Rayhana strength and she asked her daughter to help her stand up. Ifat tried to pull her mother up by her hands with all the strength she had, but she wasn't able to help her mother get up. Wherefore, Rayhana decided to crawl on her knees and move away from the place where she had been raped in front of her little child. She felt her body had been ruined and made unclean by the wicked and ungodly men in that place, and it was now unholy ground. She hoped that if they moved away from the spot, maybe her daughter would soon forget and not remember what had happened. Rayhana crawled away very slowly, and every now and then she became exhausted to the point where she had to stop and rest. The pain she felt exerting herself was more than she could bear. When she felt she was far enough away, she then asked her daughter to sit upon her lap. She ached terribly from the wounds and injuries she received to her body, and the pain was beyond anything she had ever experienced. Some of her wounds were bleeding and she tried to hide them from her daughter. She tried to hide her pain and the emotional trauma, hoping if she pretended nothing was wrong, her daughter would soon forget everything that had happened. With all that she had endured and survived, she worried most about her daughter's welfare and how could she get her to a safe place. Rayhana worried even more when she realized in a place like this they could be bitten by snakes or scorpions if they didn't freeze to death in the cold desert air. While in and out of a haze, Rayhana thought that she was living through an awful nightmare. She couldn't wrap her mind around what had happened to her on her first day in the holy city where the tomb of her prophet Muhammad and the house of Allah stood. It was the last thing she would have ever imagined could happen in the most divine and sacred place on earth. Rayhana's little knowledge of Islam made her believe that Jeddah was Mecca city, whereupon reigned the house of Allah, and Medina city, where the tomb of her prophet Muhammad was laid to rest. In fact, from Jeddah to Mecca it will take you around 1.5 hours to drive the distance of 80 kilometers. It is the most crowded road in the world. Over 3 million pilgrims travel on that single highway. Nevertheless, some crazy Arabs would drive 120 kilometers an hour and make it in 1/2 hour's time. If Rayhana had had any knowledge or warning that this terrible thing was going to happen to her, she would have never come. Of course, for that matter, no mother in the world would ever dream of her young child witnessing such a brutal rape. Whatever she allowed or suffered at the hands of wicked men, it was because she wanted to save her little girl from being raped and violated by these dangerous criminals posing as public servants. Rayhana's mind was occupied with many thoughts bubbling up like hot molten lava inside a volcano. She wanted to cry, but she suppressed her tears and did not allow them to disclose the deep pain and anguish she was feeling inside. It was best not to fall apart in front of her child, and so she hid her fears, worries, and all the devastation she felt. She hated herself for bringing her daughter with her and exposing her to such evil. Only the devil could do this to a human being and not care about raping a mother in front of her small child. If only she had foreknowledge that the devil was alive and well inside the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Rayhana could not believe a human being could become like a beast. How could a human being lust after a 7-year-old child? How could a man behave in such a beastly manner? What troubled Rehana more was the fact that these police officers were Muslims like her. While she was living in her slum surrounded by thousands of Hindu men, none of them had attacked or assaulted her inside her unprotected slum. She had never been accosted by anyone and no one had attempted to rape her while she was returning all alone at night through those dark and narrow lanes. Her Hindu neighbors were bowing down and worshipping their idols day and night, whereas the two Muslim men who raped her were supposedly kneeling down and worshipping her Allah 5 times a day. Rehana began to feel dizzy and her eyes began to flutter uncontrollably. She knew that she might collapse and faint any moment. She wanted to tell her daughter to leave her and continue walking with the hope that she might find someone to rescue her. She did not want her daughter to see her dying in such a lonesome place. She figured she was going to die anyway. When she could not crawl anymore, Rehana shared her thoughts about what she wanted her daughter to do. She told her to continue walking and not look back. If it was scared and refused to leave her mother and walk all alone in the dark and lonely dead of night. Rehana felt her child's anxiety and fear and did not insist that she leave her anymore. She did, however, gently tell her that if she fell asleep, she might never wake up again. She reminded her of how her father had fallen asleep and had not returned to them. She then told her plainly that she was going to die, and when that happened she should leave her and go away. Shortly after speaking these words to her daughter, Rehana stopped crawling, and her body fell silently into the sand and became motionless. Her daughter thought that her mother had died and would never wake up again. Ifit was afraid to walk alone in what was a strange, dark, and frightening place. She just sat near her mother's lifeless body and began to weep all over again. She was so afraid and started to shake, trembling from the chill of the brisk night winds. Her fear prevented her from falling asleep and she remained awake throughout the night. When the light of dawn ascended, her eyes became heavy with sleep and she could not stay awake any longer. She held onto the body of her mother and went to sleep on top of her. However, the hot sun and the moving sands of the desert woke her up before too long. She became very thirsty and hungry. Her thirst and hunger forced her to get up and move away from the lifeless body of her mother. She kept walking and every now and then, she stopped and looked back at her mother's still body. The road that she was walking on was rough and full of holes. Whenever one of her little feet stepped into a hole, she would fall down. She fell many times on the dusty barren road. Ifit did not walk more than an hour before her eyes spotted a small tent. She had never seen a tent before. She instinctively walked in the direction of the tent. She left the road and began to walk on the sand. She began to walk with much difficulty for the sand slowed down each step she made. Sometimes, her small feet sank into the sand up to her knees. Fortunately, she did not get stuck in what was like quicksand. When she got closer to the tent, she could hear sounds of animals and voices of human beings. Before she reached the tent, Ifit saw someone come out and begin to walk toward her. When she saw him, she became very frightened. She had never seen a person like this before. His clothes were different from any clothes she had ever seen in her life. In one hand, he was carrying a stick, and in the other hand, he was carrying a whip. Ifit thought that the man was coming to beat her. She turned around and began to run away. The man ran toward her and overtook her. She began to scream loudly when the man grabbed her and picked her up. She was screaming and looking at his face. She began to beg him in Hindi not to beat her. The man smiled and talked to her in Arabic. He could see the little girl was speaking another language. He understood the reason for her fear and threw down the stick and the whip. Ifit felt less afraid when the man threw down the stick and the whip. The Arab man carried Ifit back to his tent. When he brought her inside his tent, Ifit found she was in the presence of other children like herself and a woman like her mother. The woman gave her water and some food. After she ate the food and drank the water, the woman gave her milk to drink. The milk somehow reminded Ifit of seeing her mother nursing her little baby brother. She tried to tell the man and his wife that her mother was lying dead outside. When they did not understand her, she caught the hand of the woman and began to pull her out of the tent. The man understood what Ifit wanted and told his wife to go with her. The woman got up and walked outside the tent with Ifit. The man came outside too and followed them. Ifit took them back to the road and pointed in the direction where her mother was either dead or buried alive in the hot desert sand. She continued to pull the woman by the hand and walk her toward the place where she left her mother. It took them less than an hour to reach the area. When they arrived, they found Rehana lying in the sand. Half of her body was already buried by the moving winds of sand. The man had never seen the face, hands, legs, or body of a grown woman so openly spread and exposed before him, with the exception of his wife. He was so struck by the marvelous beauty and the physical attractiveness of Rehana's body despite her obvious wounds and bruises. His wife, however, had different feelings when she saw Rehana's body. She thought she was already dead. Nevertheless, she bent down and put her ear upon the chest of the woman. Then, she told her husband that the woman was still alive. At first, she did not want her husband to touch the body of a woman who wasn't his wife. Therefore, she tried to pick Rehana up to carry her, but the dead weight of her unconscious body made it impossible. She told her husband to carry her instead. The man immediately bent over the body of Rehana and pulled her up. His wife helped him to put Rehana's body upon his shoulder. Rehana's body slowed the man down and his wife came from behind, took Rehana's legs, and put each leg on each one of her shoulders. The man felt a little relief when his wife helped him, but he was shaking from head to toe. He had never touched a woman, other than his wife, nor had any woman's body ever come so close to his, except for his wife's. He felt a strong desire for sexual intercourse. If the little girl wasn't with them, he might have had sex with his wife out in the open. He remembered that his prophet Muhammad saw a woman walking in the street and got tempted by her. He ran to his wife Zainab bint Jahash as she was tanning leather. He ignored what she was doing and promptly had sex with her. Then, he went back to his companions and said, "When the woman comes toward you, it is Satan who is approaching you. When one of you see a woman and feel attracted to her, he should hurry to his wife. With her, it would be the same as with the other one." Wherefore, the feeling of the body of Rehana on his shoulders and hands drove the man extremely crazy. He waited impatiently until they reached their place. As soon as they laid down the half-dead woman, he pulled his wife out and took her to where they kept their livestock. Out in the open, he jumped on the body of his wife. His wife understood what the problem was and hence she did not resist or object to her husband pouncing on her, driven mad with lust. She had never felt the full aggressiveness and force of her husband's passionate rage or the powerfulness of his desire to such a magnitude. This time she enjoyed sex with him so much because for the first time in her life, she experienced an orgasm. Relieved of his lust, the man managed to tell his wife to go back to the tent and take care of the strange woman. He feared going back to the tent and seeing the beautiful woman in her exposed condition again. The people who rescued Rehana and her daughter were Arab Bedouins living in vast Saudi Arabian desert. Although they were in the 21st century, they still lived as they did in the 7th century. They had no knowledge that they were living in a country that had geographical and political boundaries. They were nomadic and moved freely from place to place in the arid desert. The Bedouin woman used water to revive Rehana. She kept sprinkling drops of water on her face until Rehana opened her eyes. She could not see anything, but her mouth moved. The Bedouin woman began to pour some milk onto her dry lips and mouth. The Bedouins believe that if someone is dehydrated from exposure to the desert sun, water is not the best thing to administer. They believe that milk is preferable in this instance. Rehana's revival and recovery was very slow. For 24 hours, she could not fully open her eyes or eat anything. Every few hours, the Bedouin woman kept alternating milk and water slowly into her mouth. She used Dettol liquid to treat her bleeding wounds and cuts. She changed her blood-stained clothes and dressed her in one of her black niqabs. Rayhana did not get any proper medical treatment. As a result, her recovery was slow and took a long time. During her treatment, the man never came inside the tent. He ate and slept outside. His wife brought him food and water. At night, she came and slept with him. The Bedouin family was part of a big tribe of Bedouins who lived in tents. They are nomadic people. They move from place to place according to the seasons of the year. The Bedouins have always lived in the desert. Once or twice a year, the men go to a nearby suburb and purchase commodities for their families. The Bedouins' animals supply them with whatever food is needed. These families have many animals. They have dogs, cats, chickens, cows, goats, sheep, donkeys, and camels. They keep dogs for guarding the family and for protecting their other animals. They keep cows for supplying milk. The goats and sheep are used for two purposes: to sell some of them once or twice a year to earn income, and to slaughter a goat or a sheep each month to feed the family. The chickens are used for producing eggs to eat. The family will also slaughter the chickens to eat. The donkeys and camels are used for transportation. In addition, the donkeys are used for traveling short distances, like going to a nearby suburb. The nomadic Arabs use the camels for traveling long distances. The camels and the donkeys are for the Bedouins like cars and trains to the modern world, for they are used as transportation to move from one place to another or to a faraway place. The camel is a very important and valuable animal for desert people because it provides transportation, food, and milk. The Arabs call the camel the desert ship. The Arab Bedouins love to drink the milk of the she-camel. It is the only milk they can drink without boiling. They also drink camel urine when they fall sick. The Prophet Muhammad ordered his followers to drink camel milk and urine whenever they fall sick. A visitor to a Bedouin family might think at first that the only animal the family keeps devoid of any benefit are the cats. However, he would soon discover that of all the animals, the cats are the most useful. They are kept for warding off rats, snakes, scorpions, and lizards. For 1 month, Rayhana and her daughter were allowed to stay with the family. They treated them as if they were their own family members. If it was treated as if she was a daughter born into the family. The Bedouin man did not harass Rayhana in any way. He always kept himself at a far distance from her. His wife was the same age as Rayhana. They had 3 daughters and 1 son. Their children were all younger than Ifat, but as soon as the new girl came into their family, they began to like her and play with her. Ifat, in a surprisingly short time, was able to pick up some Arabic. Although she was living among good people, Rayhana constantly thought of her 5 sons. She also thought a lot about her mother. She knew that she had left her sons and her mother enough money to live on for a long time. But, how would her mother feed her sons after all the money was gone? Would she send her grandchildren into the streets to beg for money and food? And what would happen to her children if her mother died? For these reasons, Rayhana knew that one day she would have to leave the Bedouin family. She would either have to find some work to earn money to send back home, or she would have to return to India to work again in the homes of the wealthy people in order to feed her family. It took her 1 month to come to that agonizing conclusion. One of the major problems for Rayhana was where she would go to find some work, and just how would she go about getting to this work. She feared the police might arrest them again because they had no official papers. Shortly after pondering this dilemma, a solution presented itself with the appearance of the Bedouin man who happened to be saddling up his donkey for a trip. He was going to the nearest suburb to sell one of his sheep and to buy some commodities for his family. His preparations didn't go unnoticed by Rayhana, and she motioned for him to take her with him on the donkey. She initially thought about leaving her daughter with the Bedouin family to venture out to find work or a solution to her problem. The Bedouin woman, however, objected and stood in between her husband and Rayhana, flatly refusing to allow her husband to travel alone with a strange woman for endless hours. Additionally, another huge difficulty presented itself. As custom mandated, Rayhana could not travel alone with him, for she was not his wife, sister, or daughter. His wife was acutely aware of her husband's behavior once he had set his eyes upon Rayhana's unconscious body and carried her through the desert to their tent. She fully expected that he would either convince Rayhana to sleep with him or force himself upon her should she refuse his advances. The hadith of the Prophet Muhammad came to mind: when a man and a woman are isolated in the presence of each, Satan is bound to be their third companion. Rayhana yielded to his wife's uneasiness with the situation and chose to take her daughter with her. Even so, the Bedouin woman was still not in favor of Rayhana accompanying her husband. The wife asked her husband to leave Rayhana with her and to travel alone. The Bedouin man insisted she should come along to find her family. When his wife continued to strongly object, he used his stick to chastise her. Rayhana felt guilty witnessing this sudden flogging. The kind woman who had taken care of her and her daughter for the past month was now being punished because of the presence of an uninvited visitor. Rayhana's conscience greatly disturbed her, and she could not go against the wishes of her most loving caregiver. Having practiced various forms of communication while staying with the Bedouins, Rayhana used gesturing and signing in an attempt to resolve the matter and the guilty feeling she felt inside. She took hold of the woman's hand and beckoned the children to come along with them. It was in this way that she convinced the Bedouin man to bring his wife and children along with them. The Bedouin man seemed to understand but looked unhappy with the additional company. The Bedouin customarily traveled to the suburbs on his donkey. On this particular trip, he changed his mind and decided to take his camel. He wanted to show off his abilities to care for an extended family and growing harem of women. The rest of his entourage were given donkeys to mount. The first donkey bore the Bedouin's wife and 2 of their children. Rayhana and her daughter shared their beast with one of his daughters. This was Rayhana's first time riding a donkey. She had a nagging fear that the donkey might throw them off. The gentle beast soon placated her fear as it began to clop along dutifully behind the camel and the other donkey. Rayhana was preoccupied with thoughts of her unknown future but gradually gave in to the newness of travel by donkey. Her delight increased at the sound of the Bedouin singing in his native tongue. Not understanding the language, she somehow supposed that he was happy and singing to his camel. In those unfamiliar surroundings, Rayhana remembered her lover and longed for his company and warm embraces. She wished he was sitting with her on the donkey and singing romantic love songs to her as she enjoyed the slow stride of the small caravan. Whereas it takes only an hour by car to travel the same distance, the trip took 6 hours by slow-moving beasts of burden. It did not help that the little children would every now and then ask to answer the call of nature. As is the custom, a child urinates and defecates by the roadside. Lacking water or the option of toilet paper, the Bedouin children use stones to clean up. The Bedouin himself stopped his camel 3 times to relieve himself. Both Rayhana and the Bedouin's wife made a stop, and like the children, they used smooth stones to clean themselves. In actual fact, using stones is a recommended practice in the religion of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad himself endorsed using 3 smooth stones for cleaning should there be no water. After cleaning, a Muslim is expected to utter the following prayer of thanksgiving to Allah: "Praise be to Allah who relieved me from my pain and filth." Muslims will proudly tell you that Prophet Muhammad teaches them everything about defecation and every matter conducting daily life. From the time of awakening, until one retires at night, the Prophet Muhammad provides the commandments of Allah for the faithful. There are even rules and regulations regarding a woman's menstrual cycle. Rules also dictate how a Muslim man should initiate sex with his wife. An Egyptian Muslim scholar quoting the Prophet Muhammad, once said that on the wedding night, the bridegroom is permitted to remove all the clothing of his new bride with the exception of her underwear. He added that, it is unlawful for the man at any time or under any circumstances to touch or remove his wife's underwear. This right belongs to the woman. The Prophet Muhammad also said, when anyone goes to the lavatory, he or she should not touch his or her penis or vagina nor clean his or her private parts with his or her right hand. Sahih al-Bukhari. Islam commands Muslims to use their left hands for this purpose. This hand, however, is not used for eating. As it goes, the right hand is for the mouth and the left hand is for the privates. Some Muslim scholars teach that a Muslim man shouldn't even look at his penis. The fourth caliph and the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, Ali, is called Allah blessed his face because he had never seen his penis in all his life. His wife, Fatima, is called Al-Zahra, which means the pure one because she had never had menses in all her life. This might be impossible to believe because Fatima al-Zahra had many children with her husband Ali. The travelers broke their journey to eat, and in this, the legacy of the Prophet loomed once more. The Prophet charged Muslims to eat and drink together from the same plate and cup. Following this, it is recommended that a person must suck and lick his fingers after eating. This might sound unhygienic, but Muslims obey this because their Prophet dictates it. As the 6-hour journey drew to a close, the beasts of burden arrived at a suburb on the outskirts of Jeddah. After some shopping, the Bedouins bid Rayhana and her daughter farewell and wished them success. Rayhana shed tears while hugging the Bedouin woman and kissing her children goodbye. She offered her hand to the Bedouin man to say goodbye, but he refused it. He muttered something in Arabic, of which Rayhana understood only one word. As a Muslim, she was intimately acquainted with the word haram, which means forbidden. Not shaking hands with women is based on the words of Prophet Muhammad, "I do not shake the hands of women," mentioned in Al-Nasi'i, Al-Tirmizi and Ibn Majah. Moreover, Aisha said, "By Allah, the hand of the Messenger of Allah never touched another woman, other than his wives. He used to take their pledges verbally only." Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. As the Bedouins mounted up and rode away, Rayhana became emotional and troubled with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She was tempted to take her daughter, go back to the Bedouins, and live with them. It was only for the well-being of her family in India that forced her to restrain her rising panic and stay behind. She stood still for a long time while gazing at the loving family fading into the distance, disappearing from her life and that of her daughter. They had been so kind and caring to them. But now that she was alone here with her daughter, one thought repeatedly troubled her. She wondered if the people in this holy city would be anything like the Bedouin family. Long after the Bedouin family vanished from sight, she pondered her options. They had no money. They had no home. They had no proof of identity. They had become nothing. What were they going to eat and where were they going to sleep? They had no protection. Anyone could take advantage of them or harm them. As it was, while Rayhana was standing and looking at the people walking by, 2 men were watching her very carefully. One wanted to take advantage of her and the other intended to do her harm. The former was an Indian, and the latter, a Saudi. The Indian man was a pimp from Hyderabad. Prior to getting his Saudi Arabian visa, he was part of a marriage agency company catering to Indian and Arab Muslims wanting to connect. Hyderabad was the only city in India that had marriage agencies. The main business of these marriage agencies, however, was the procurement of young female children for Arab pedophiles. The Saudi, a correctional police office, was watching Rayhana. He suspected her of being a Christian prostitute from the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, or India. He was reasonably sure that she was Christian because Muslim prostitutes prefer the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. This is where big money can be made. Being a prostitute in Saudi Arabia is the most dangerous job in the world. If a prostitute is caught red-handed, she is to be stoned to death the following Friday. If the correctional officer finds a woman walking, standing all alone, or talking to a man other than her husband, father, or brother, they will arrest her as a prostitute. Countries that criminalize prostitution all have prescribed penalties for prostitutes, pimps, enablers, and sometimes, for the customers. A Muslim country, however, often requires the prostitute to be executed. The Indian was trying to discreetly draw Rehana's attention so that he could make a deal with her. He had many wealthy Saudi customers for just such a transaction. He stood in a corner waving to her, but Rehana did not see him. He even whistled to her, but she was preoccupied, miles away in thought. In another dark corner, the Saudi correctional police hid and passed the time. He was just waiting for a man to come and talk to the woman or pick her up in his car. He could then have her stoned to death on the following Friday. He noticed the woman's little daughter with her, but it did nothing to sway his conviction she was a prostitute, because he knew full well that hookers often use children as a cover for criminal mischief. When no one approached Rehana, he decided to punish her for a lesser crime. In Saudi Arabia, a woman is not allowed to be in public alone. She must be accompanied by her husband or a muhrim, defined as a man that is unlawful for her to wed, such as her father, brother, or an adult son. A cousin is not a muhrim, because in Islam a woman is allowed to marry her cousin or close kin. A muhrim is also neither a father-in-law nor a brother-in-law, as the Prophet Muhammad has decreed that in-laws are like death to the wife. Rehana, being alone in the street according to Sharia law, should be flogged. Still rooted by indecision, Rehana felt a sharp crippling blow that paralyzed her and sent her to her knees. Ifrit screamed at the sight of her mother's assailant bearing a staff as long as she was tall. As he lifted his staff once again and brought it down on the crumpled form of her mother, Ifrit turned and fled. Her escape was blocked by the Indian man. Ifrit was screaming, let me go, he's hurting my mother." The Indian spoke to her in Urdu. Speaking urgently, he explained that he could save her and her mother from that man. All she had to do was say that he was her father. Ifrit, not knowing any better, agreed. The man rushed towards the correctional police of Allah with Ifrit in his arms, animatedly announcing in Arabic that the woman was his wife and the little girl, his daughter. Rehana lay crumpled on the pavement weeping. She did not know why the Arab was beating her. The so-called police officer did not wear a uniform. She could be forgiven for thinking he was psychotic, but she wasn't too far off. He was an Arabic mutawa by definition, one whose duty is to tame wild animals. Here was a man whose place in society was to domesticate wild women. This particular designation comes about because of the relative status of the Muslim woman in Muslim societies. The degradation of women to the level of animals is enshrined in the misogynistic teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. Amongst is the following, which says, "When one of you prays without a sutra, a dog, an ass, a pig, a Jew, a Magian, and a woman annuls his prayer." Sunan Abu Dawud, Hadith number 2704. In his farewell speech the Prophet Muhammad said, "Treat women well, for they are domestic animals with you and do not possess anything for themselves." Al-Tabari Volume 9, page number 1754. Rehana was so enraged at the sight of the Indian carrying her daughter that she forgot about the Arab. Still weeping, she demanded of him, "Why didn't you call the police and have him arrested? He beat me for no good reason. You must be new here in this country. That man is a correctional police officer. He would have arrested you and you would have been stoned to death if I had not come at the right time and rescued you from his hand. I haven't done anything wrong. I was just standing here with my daughter. He came behind me and just started beating me. He did not even talk to me or ask me to go. It is his duty to beat any woman he finds standing or walking without her husband, father, or brother. I lied to him and told him that you are my wife, that is why he left you alone. Otherwise, he would have arrested you. By the way, where is your husband and where do you live?" "I have no husband. I have no place of my own. My daughter and I are strangers in this city. Some policemen beat us and robbed us of our traveling papers." Rehana began weeping again and the Indian knelt down and comforted her. He promised to help her by inviting her to his home and extending an offer for accommodation, with them both being Indians and all.